Hi, my name is Ganesh Kumar and I'm a full stack developer and a lead software engineer. I have 15 years of experience and I have delivered 100 plus UIs for different companies. For the past 5 years, I've been training engineers and help them settle in their jobs. So this is my first course on Udemy, the course called Learn CSS from Scratch. In this course, I talked about very essential stuff about CSS, like what are the different types of CSS, what are the selectors, what are the metrics used in CSS, and what is block element model or box model, what is FlexBox model, what is grid model, also what is a responsiveness means, and how to work with CSS preprocessors. It's everything that you need to understand CSS. Even if you're a senior developer who is working with Tailwind, Bootstrap, or other CSS frameworks, having no clue about how they are operating, this course is for you to overcome your day-to-day challenges with these frameworks and debug you with your own way, or override CSS that you really don't want to use that is coming out of the box. So I'm excited. I hope you're also excited. So let's get the learning begin. Thank you. What should be the goal of CSS? What we can do with CSS? Okay. That is the question you should ask. So using CSS, the goal is using CSS, you need to create layouts. So if you surf the internet, you see some layouts for a product, saying that some buttons here, some logo here, and you got a nice banner talking about a product, okay, a product image or video or anything, and you see some text here to attract the content, and finally you will be provided a button to buy it or something. And again, about some features here about the product and some of the things that you wanted to know information more about the product and so on. So HTML basically gives a coding structure, like this is the element starts and this is the element ends and so on. So this is inside that element, that inside this element, but this hard structure has to be translated into this beautiful website. So that is the job of CSS. Okay. So using CSS, you can add different properties to these elements. So let's just say you can pick a div element and apply some other CSS saying the color should be something. Color should be red, or the width should be this 200, or height should be this 200, and so on. So you can continue to define the properties and its values, and you will continue to select each individual element like so. Like you select the topmost layer and apply some CSS, and you select the inner layer and you write some CSS. Like that, you will write CSS for every element that you see on the page. Okay, you might write one style and you might be using in multiple places like this, but you will have those styles defined, and those styles together make the entire design of the page. So that is what you do with CSS. Let's look at CSS in real time. Let's try to understand by coding. So here is a sample HTML document, and here is an element. So this is the opening tag, this is the closing tag, and this is an attribute and its value. So basically you can write CSS as an attribute and its value, like style attribute is the attribute dedicated to take in CSS and render it onto the element. So you could write color, you could define a color, a red, and if you save it. So basically what's happening here, browser is picking up the HTML and then parsing the HTML, creating a rendering tree or a DOM tree, and then picks up the attributes from the elements and understands that it is a style attribute and it has some style declarations, and then takes up these styles and apply onto the particular element. So that's how it works. So we need to understand how many different types of properties are there, and how do we assign some values to those properties to render the desired result on the browser. So that's what about learning CSS is. The standard syntax of CSS is this. So first we will have a selector and then braces. Inside that braces, we'll have a property and its value. We can have multiple properties and assign multiple values to properties. That means we need to understand how many types of selectors are out there and how many different properties are out there, and how can we assign some values to it to get the desired output, to render the element like we exactly imagined. So that's the goal should be. So let's start our learning from this file itself. So what is CSS? CSS is simply a set of key value pairs for the browser to understand and how it should render it onto the viewport that is available here. So for each element that is here will have certain set of key value pair describing the style that it should render. So that sheet itself is called style sheet, and CSS full form is cascading style sheet. So you will write a sheet of styles that will describe each element on how they should render. But you haven't written any CSS, but you still see some CSS in the developer menu. So how did I come to this developer menu? If you have opened this file in a browser, and if you click on this, if you right click on that particular element and hit the inspect, this window will land you in this section. This section you can almost hit any element in here and see what is the style applied in the style section. Of course, there are different sections. We will talk about these different sections, how they will work, but for now we will keep our focus in the style section. Okay, so now this h1 element having this many styles already predefined. So is it a good thing? Yes, browser does have some pre-built CSS assigned, like if I create a paragraph element, okay, and if I save it and if I refresh it, this paragraph renders in a different form. That means browser does have few inbuilt styles. So these styles may behave differently in different browsers. So it is a good practice that we flatten out these default styles provided by browser and start on a fresh boilerplate template. So how can I do that? You can go to Google and type about reset CSS, and you'll find numerous reset CSS, but I'll go with the one that is on top of the Google result. So let me copy this. So this reset style CSS will actually level all the default CSS styles that are applied onto the HTML elements. So let me copy this. Let me come to this section, and where should we write our CSS? We should write our CSS here in the header, saying like this. And if we save this file, if we come back, if we refresh, now all the styles have got reset. So we got a boiler template to start from. Now everything is flattened out. Now you can start coding your CSS to kind of come into shape. In this video, let us try to understand the CSS selectors. CSS selectors are used to target a specific element with a specific pattern and change its style. So for example, let us take some elements in this section. So that we have a div tag. In that div tag we have a couple of paragraph tags, heading, and we have different types of list elements with their LIs in them. And let us understand what are the different selectors that are out there that can select these elements and apply some styles. This is one selector that can target this div. So this div has an attribute of ID and the attribute value is root. You can target this div with this ID selector in CSS. The syntax of this ID selector is #root, and whatever you write in these two braces will be directly applied onto this div tag. This tag here select two different paragraph tag. This is one single selector. Unlike the ID selector. ID selector will only look for one ID value and it will target that specific element. But the tag selector, in other words, will actually select all the elements that matches this pattern. So the paragraph tag, wherever there in the document, these styles will be picked up and applied. Similarly, the heading tag as well. So if you refer heading 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so you can write the styles against that tag type and that styles will be picked up and applied. Another selector is the class selector. So this expression will actually look for the attribute type of class and its value list. If it finds an element that matching with that specific pattern, it will pick up the styles from here and apply. So in this case, you will define it once and actually go and apply the class on specific element so that you will see these styles applied on them. So we have few more selectors, but these are all the fundamental types of selectors. We will learn about pseudo selectors, pseudo elements, attribute selector as we move into this module. Next is the ID selector. ID selector syntax starts with the pound symbol and then you name your ID identifier. So I'll say my heading and maybe the syntax should be this, my heading, and let me copy this element. To apply the ID selector, you need to actually use ID attribute. So now you need to copy this name of the ID selector and have that as a attribute value to the ID attribute. So here, unlike classes, you can have multiple references to that same ID, but you cannot have multiple IDs mentioned here like this, my heading 2. So classes, you can have as many classes as you want on the single attribute, but in the case of ID, one ID for the one element. So ID means identifier. So maybe the intention behind naming it, writing the syntax as it is to identify one particular element out of the bunch of elements. So let me have some styles to see it is really working. This time around I selected red, and if I save it, yes, my ID selector is being applied on the element. So that's how you write an ID selector. So for this example, let me use the internal style of CSS. So I'm creating the style tag. So here, let me create a class selector. So a class selector always starts with a dot notation, and then you have a class name to it. So maybe, so heading main, and this class has to be mentioned on the particular element, the target element's class attribute. So you can have multiple classes for the same attribute, like heading, title. So like that, you can have n number of classes mentioned here, and you can write those classes in the style section to render them in browser. So for now, let me remove everything. So this is my selector with dot notation, starting with dot notation, the selector name, and I mentioned the same selector on the class attribute like this. And let me write some CSS at a font size to 30px and color. You could see the selector has checked for the expression in the HTML. It matches the expression with this class attribute, and it finds that class is mentioned there and picks up these CSS and applies it on the element. Let us understand the combinator selectors. Combinator selectors help you to combine the other selectors with a useful relationship to each other. So basically you can select elements that are descendant. You can select a specific child in a parent, or you can select adjacent general siblings. Let's talk about the descendant combinator. First, suppose if we have a div that has a paragraph tag in it as a child item, And if you wanted to select this element, you generally do this, say paragraph, and this will select all the paragraphs that are out there. So, and I can write a color to it. Now I can see that is being changed here. What if you wanted to only select the paragraph tag that is inside the div? So you can do that with the descendant combinator. So you can have that parent selector here and separate both of them by a single space. Now, if you see the paragraph that is inside the div, the first one has affected, the second one has not. This can be a class selector, ID selector, or whatever it is, and this can also be some other selector. But if we are separating out both of them with a single space and in a single line, that means we are saying that to find the selector 2 elements in selector 1 element. The next is the child combinator. Child combinator actually selects the immediate childs of that particular element. So in the case of descendant selectors, this particular selector selects all the elements that are inside this parent. But here in this case, it will select the immediate childs of that particular parent selector. So if I have that OL here, and inside the OL I have LI. So here I have a UL with a class name of list. So if I write a selector for this, this would become the selector for that class selector for that UL list. But if I wanted to select immediate childs of that particular parent elements, that means I'm trying to select these two LIs. So let me have some content. So this particular selector should select the immediate childs of this list class. So LI1, 2 should be selected, 3 should not be selected. Let me write styles to confirm that. Background color green. So I want to apply some margin for each element so that I could distinguish elements. As you could see, the selector has only selected these two immediate childs but ignored the third element, which is inside OL. The adjacent sibling selector represented by plus sign between selector 1 and selector 2. It will select the elements that are matching with this selector, and they should be adjacent to this element that are matching with this selectors. Let's understand this as an example. So let's say we have a heading here, says this is heading, and a paragraph that says this. Now if I create a style says that h1 plus p, so this indicates that a paragraph that is next to a heading should be selected and applied these styles. So I can write some styles to that. So background color. If I save it, you could see the element that is adjacent to this h1 element has got selected and styles got applied. Next up in our list is the general sibling combinator. This combinator represented by tilde symbol. Elements that are matching to this selector. The elements matching to this selector 2 should be adjacent to the selector. So that means if there is a heading tag, there can be a div tag, and next there can be a paragraph tag. Now this selector should select this paragraph and this paragraph, and they shouldn't be immediate sibling. They can be followed by some other elements between. So if I have to rephrase this, let me copy this selector and let me have this to blue, and now I'll say h2. Now this h2 selects this element, and this combinator indicates all the paragraphs after that element. That means these two paragraphs have got highlighted and the styles are applied. So what is box model? In a nutshell, box model is nothing but this particular snippet that you see very often. Zoom it. So a box model is composition of margin, border, padding, and height and width of a property. Nothing but that. So if I say height 300 pixels, width 300 pixels, and border 1 px, okay, and solid, and the color is red, and these two borders are touching. I don't want these to be touching, so I want some margin. Okay, margin I can apply on 4 sides. On top I want 2 pixels margin, on left I don't want some margin, and it goes, this particular values goes in a clockwise order. First, if you look at your monitor, top, right, bottom, and left, that is the flow of these values. Top, right, bottom, and left. And I want some padding because my content is touching my borders. Okay, padding. Okay, all sides I want. Okay, I have a width of this element. What is the width here? 322 px by 322 px. That is the width of this box. But what did I actually assign? 300 by 300. The real box size is height and width plus padding plus border plus margin. So that is the exact height. The margin bottom is 2 pixels and margin top is 2 pixels. When this margin collides, it will only take either top or bottom. So you might think, okay, I applied margin bottom 2 pixels, sorry, top 2 pixels for this element, top 2 pixels, but 2 pixels from a top also should come, and this should be 4, right? This should be a little bit more than what it is looking, but that's not the case. Okay, the top and bottom, when they are touching, when they are colliding, they'll either be bottom or top. That is one another thing that you should remember. These elements are coming one below the other. How do I make them come beside the other? Okay, so there is a property called display in CSS. Okay, FlexBox, FlexRoot, Grid, and we will look at all these things in later sessions. So by default, all of the elements are block. These are all block elements, but I can convert these block elements to have inline. So make them inline element. When you look at these things, okay, they are now inline elements. Inline element doesn't take any width and height. Always remember, when you set the display property to inline, the height, width, padding and margin doesn't apply on these inline elements. Okay, I want these items to inline, but I still want to consider the height and width and border and margin and padding. Then you should use inline block property. Okay, so when you use inline block property, if there is a available width for that, look at this, 300 and 300, but the overall width is below 600. Okay, these two cannot fit together. Okay, that is below 600. It will push the next element to the next, but if there is a available width, the next element will go beside to that element. So that is inline block. You can have this width and heights in percentages as well. Let's say I don't want this height to be applied. So let me close this inspect element. Sorry. The available width is what? Let me put it in the bottom so that 960 pixels. That is pretty much room space for 300 width elements. Okay. Why do I have some space on the body? Okay, you have some margin on the body and padding on the body. You never keep this open. Okay, keep these styles. Per row there should be 300, but there is an extra space here that is going for body. That's the problem here. So you set this margin to 0. Now the exact height and width will be split across. So body was eating some space. That is the reason there was no space for the boxes to come. When I reset the body thing, now your calculation fits in 300, 300, 300. The available width is somewhere around 900. Now let me rephrase my styles to percentages instead of having the borders, margin, padding and everything. I just wanted to create two columns in the layout, so I let me reset everything because I don't need these margins and paddings and everything. So I'm trying whether if I can fit two boxes in a row. Let's say save it. It's not fitting in, everything is coming below, one below the other, so I'm not getting it. So yeah, probably I think I should try with 49.333 because there is some hidden space around these elements and I really didn't didn't take into account. Okay, so earlier the padding was adding up to the whole box size. Now we got the basic structure for our website. So now we will characterize each box into a different box. Header, okay. I want the header to take up the 100% width. I'm replacing it. Okay. Now I have header. So I'll say header and height 70 px, background color. I've got the header. Now I need navigation. So basically you if you want two column mostly, you put your width like this and create the base style and then start customizing your elements. Nav, okay. You're just playing with width. Now I just need the same thing, but I just need the navigation to be 40 pixels height, nothing more. And the background color is something this. This is not looking good. Maybe maroon. Okay. Yeah. Color white. Now you need two layouts or three layouts. Okay. You would say 1, 2, 3, 4 boxes for body content. Maybe I have 3 features to discuss. Body 1, maybe feature box. So I'll say I'm overriding the base CSS. I'm creating feature box width to have 33.333. So I get 100% divided by 3. So feature box, I want 3 boxes. Okay, so 3 boxes have not aligned. Feature, feature, and feature. Feature 1 feature is coming bottom, but I just wanted to adjust that. Okay, 3 features have come there. And height 300 px. Background color to distinguish, I might use a different color, my feature box. And finally, if I want some body content, I can go or I can remove other 2 boxes and say footer. Again, my footer should be 100 pixels width, 100%. And maybe I just need 300 pixels of height. And I need background color, maybe black. I think probably you understood how the layout structure should go. Okay. For the demonstration purposes, I have used heights here, but really these heights will get replaced by your original content in your site and you don't have to specify any heights. In the further videos, let's understand more layout modules in CSS. Same like border, we have individual properties and shorthand for background. So you can have background color as a color as a background. So you can define a color. So this, as you could see, there is a color applied as a background. Background image is the property. I want you to load an image from a URL. URL is a method. And with that method strategy, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go to images and load this. So this is actually happening from the location that your CSS is my CSS location is this, the topmost location. So I have this dot image folder, already image folder, and beside that. So that's the link I have given here. And if I increase the box size, like width to 500 px and height to 600 px, okay, and I really see that background image coming up, but you couldn't see that because that image is really big. Okay, you can bring that image onto the view, okay, by saying contain it. Just bring that particular element, particular item, to just contain that. So I have your image might be bigger, and maybe 300, the size of that image is somewhere around 2000 pixels, okay, 1920 by 1200, but the size I have for this background is this, somewhere around 500 by 600. But if you wanted to scale it down, the image to scale it down and appear in that one particular box, no matter whatever the size of the image, you can use this property called contain, or you can use the same size, 500 px, width by 600 px, height. And you would see the problem with this is it will stretch that image, okay, and it will certainly does not look good. Okay, I would not use the size property, but let me comment out these two things for now and see the problem here. Okay, this contain property reduce the width of that particular image, but the height is not really enough, and so it is repeating again and again. Let me increase the size to 1200. You see that image keep repeating itself, but sometimes you want this to happen and sometimes you don't want to happen. So how do you handle it? So you say background repeat is the property to stop it. So you want to repeat it, you can set it to repeat. You want repeat in x only, like on the x-axis. You don't want to happen that on the y-axis, that is this. And you could see our still background color property is being applied, okay, but you stopped the repetition on the y-axis, but you allowed it to be on the x-axis. Okay, so if I have this width to be 1200 px, 1920 was the size of it, so 1920. Okay, beyond 1920, if I give it maybe 2000, you would see the repetition already happening. Okay, 2500. So it is repeating on the x. So you can control it with saying no repeat. So you don't want to repeat it anymore. Just one time, no matter whatever the size it has, it will not repeat, just stays the same. So you can repeat it on x, you can repeat it on y, and you can give it a size, you can contain it 200 px by 200 px size. And if you want to repeat, it keeps repeating for the entire 200 pixel by 200 pixel size, and it will repeat to the entire available space. So that's how you use these three attributes. So you can use the position property as well. You can start the position, because if I revert back, so I want to start maybe from left hand side to right hand side, top, right. So you don't see a difference here, but if I remove this contain property, you would see the difference. Okay, so top left, you would see the image, left portion of the image is actually starting now. This portion of the image is being started. So, or if you wanted this portion of the image to be filled first, from top, from left, you can say top, right. So now if I save this file, this portion will be loading. So it will start stretching from this direction. Let me increase the size to 600 by 600. you would see the difference. See, you can put it center and center. Okay, you might have important thing in the center and you want the position, the background should be applying from center. You can use center and centers. Always separate your, always hyphenate your selectors. Okay, never ever say, like this. Don't, I mean, this is also a use case. You can, capitalize your words always, but I prefer, or the preferred way of naming your classes is hyphenate every word in your classes, and don't say CLS or N, don't use that kind of words. Okay, this is also a class name, but it will take some time to kind of understand. So prefer the full name, it like this: header, logo, section. So this is how you should go. Okay, and then I want you to install a plugin called Prettier on your machines. Okay, this particular thing that has almost 24 million downloads. So always have this Prettier plugin installed from your extension. This extension should be downloaded and come to CSS. For Macs and Linuxes, it is always Command Shift P, or for Windows, Control Shift P. So that is the command. You come here, search for format document. So if you hit it, your styles will be formatted automatically. You don't have to do that. So let's see, the spacing that I have is really inappropriate. So if I try to format that, the Prettier extension will take care about formatting and having nice looking, the indentation like this. If I have no indentation, it will still work. Okay. It will still work, but this is not properly looking, right? You can have this many styles. You probably might have done this, but always use this formatter and it will make sure the formatting is aligned in your CSS. And the next important item is font family. Comma separated font names. So, and if system doesn't have Courier, no, it will fall on Courier or it will fall on monospace. But in today's case, it's not the same thing because you can download the font. Okay, how do you download the font? Let me give you an example. Go to font start. You see through this fonts and you can make a choice of yours. I always prefer Roboto. I can add these styles. I like all these styles. Thin italic, light, these are all the different font styles you have, but a particular font, and you make a selection of those particular fonts. Okay, and finally you get a link. You can import these things like this. So you can have an internal style that is importing, or you can link these CSS files. Okay, so that you can get this. So you can copy this thing, come here and paste it here. Now I can use this particular font family, this particular font family. The font name is Open Sans and it is the fallback font is sans serif. So copy this, and if I use this here, I'll get the same font on my site too, Open Sans. Okay, you can apply the same on to make it global. So probably the best thing I would do is I'll say body tag. Simply I put my font family on body and I would see that applied everywhere. So let me give you a demonstration whether the font really applied or not. So go to body and uncheck it. You can check and uncheck and see what's happening. Okay, let me go back to here. I wanted to apply this thin font on this particular text. So class thin text. Okay, copy this thin text, come here, thin text, and font weight. I'm sorry. So what is the weight that you wanted to use? So the weight is here, it is light 300. I can use 300 because I added that into my fonts list. And if I come back, I see that light tone applied onto my font as well. So you can change, you can look back at your style selections that you made: 700 basic, 700 italic, 800, or most commonly used font weight is bold and bolder. Maybe you can change it italic, so bold italic will apply, like font style italic. And when you see this, when you apply these two styles, you can see that italic 400 or italic 500, okay, italic 600 will be applied. So this particular font does have a bundle of all other fonts, and you can use that font styles and font weight and font, together in this. Now let us understand some of the pseudo selectors for selecting child elements. So in this case, if I have a UL element and if I have 8 or 9 LI items, okay, and let me have some style text in them. Let me open this file in the live server. I have a UL and different child items here. Okay, now you have pseudo selectors that can select each individual item. So you could select the first element in the UL li first element with the first child attribute, and you can apply the background color. As you could see, this pseudo selector has selected the first element, and the same way you can select the last child as well. So you don't have to know the exact count and exact position of the last one. You could simply say just select the last child. This is not only applied to a particular li or ul, but any sort of element. I have this paragraph div. So this is the child of this div element, and there are numerous childs in this div element, and now I can modify this selector to select a particular type of childs in that element and select that. So it doesn't have to be a list or li. It should be series of specific type of HTML elements that are part of a single parent, and they will have that relation already in them, and you could rely on this selector to select the first and last childs. Not only that, so let me remove this thing and revert back to ul li so that our demo will be clean. Now if I wanted to select a specific item, not just first and last, we can do that too. The pseudo selector for that is nth child of 1, that selects 1, 2, 3. If you know a number, specific number, you can select with the number also. Or if you wanted to select all the even ones, okay, now this selector is applying the blue color on all the even ones, and you can have another selector to select all the odd ones, and you can apply a different background color here. You could see all the odd ones are being applied this green color, green shade, and you could see this blue color applied on all the even elements. So we know what are attributes. HTML element comprises of tags and attributes. So this is the example of an attribute. So this is the attribute class, and it is the attribute value. So in CSS, there is a way that we can select these elements based on the attributes and its values. So let me show you an example. Let me create a style file for that. Alright, I have created the style CSS, so let me have it here. So I have the styles here, I have my HTML here. Here I have 4 different anchor links with different href values. Here I have 4 different anchor links with different href values. I'll try selecting each of the element with the attribute selector. So yeah, some basic background to make this preview looks good, so nothing fancy. So it's just background border and padding, and just made this anchor tags to display block. Without this property, these anchor elements would actually come in a same line, but I made them to display block so that you could see some difference between the selections I make. Anchor tag, which is having href attribute, should be highlighted and its background color should be red. The href attribute, and all of them have got highlighted and the background color is applied. But if I change this condition or the comparison to match with this value, now this selector will only apply on the first element, as you could see, because we are matching the href should be having a value of google.com. It doesn't matter if there is a space here, a space both side of the equal to or something. It's not matching the string as is, but it is matching the attribute and its value. And next, if we wanted to select something that is that does have a value in it, it's not just the whole comparison but at least a value in it, so we can do that. If I copied the same line and I just wanted to check if a word contains www or starts with www, the expression that we need to change is that this. So this expression will select the items that are starting with www, and that color that should be applied is blue, because all of them are red and we are not able to distinguish, and the color should be white. Now, 2 elements, they have this word www in the starting of the string, and that is matching to this expression here, and those styles have applied onto the both elements. And we can check if a particular word or particular element is ending with a specific word. So we could check this data link attribute. This data link attribute ends with attribute value, ends with this word called website, and the expression to check that is the $sign. So this dollar or equal to will only select the item that's whose attribute value is ending with the website. This only applied on the element that is matching with this expression. And there's another expression that you can look for a particular value inside the whole string. Okay, so if I can copy this and change the expression to asterisk, and if I wanted to select the element and the target is, so the href does contain Facebook, that should be highlighted in blue. So that's the expression that we have here. Now if you could see, this and this both applied, and let me remove this so that we can verify that, or let me change the background color of this guy so that we could see that this is the expression is matching with this element, and this is the background color that is applied there. So we can check if there is a attribute present on the element. We can check for the attribute and its value exact match. We can check if the attribute value is starting with particular word, or we can check if a attribute value ending with a certain word with $sign, and this expression we are checking if there is a word called Facebook there at all in the value of the attribute. There are variety of elements in HTML such as font, image, input elements. So each of these elements have different states. For example, if we take a button, For this button, there is a state that, when I hover, there is a state. When I click, there is a color change. So each of the, change on the element represent a different state of that particular element. So another example is input type text. And if I have disabled this, you could see the state of disabled is like this. If I remove this disabled attribute, the state that is in is completely different. So each of the elements have different states, and each different state has a pseudo selector attributed to the elements. For this H1 here, if I wanted, I can highlight the first letter with this pseudo selector. Actually, we don't only need one colon after the selector. So this can be any selector, a tag selector, ID or class or attribute. This selector can be any selector, and a colon will represent the pseudo state of that element. Here it is the first letter. So we can say font size 2M. Now you could see that one first letter is highlighted. And same way we have for H3, we can highlight the first line, and we can change the color of that first line. Okay, we get that first line background color set, but we only have one line. So if I copy paste this same text, that might give us two lines. You could see that one first line got that yellow background to it. Here we have different types of HTML elements, so that I can demonstrate pseudo classes on each individual element. So there's a class, common class assigned to them, that is input element in short. So I've added some generic styles for these elements so that they are bigger enough to see on the screen. And now I'm going to apply pseudo selectors or pseudo classes on these elements using this class, because this class is present on all of the elements, and I'm going to use this class as an anchor for all of them, and will apply all the pseudo classes through this class only. So whenever an element a mouse hovers to an element which is having this class, apply these styles. That's the declaration of this statement. So that's what we are saying here with this statement. So if I save this and go back, when I hover on any of these elements, we are seeing the same color being applied. And we can also apply active. So if it is active, okay, to differentiate, we'll change the background color here so that we could see what's happening. So if this button is active and we pressed it, and that's when you see the state and this style being applied. Same thing goes here, same goes here, same goes here. Okay, so we have another pseudo class called disabled. Okay, so what is the disabled item here? We have this input element that is disabled. If it is disabled, I wanted to display a background of ash color. So if I remove this disabled attribute from here, you could see the styles are not being applied. If I have this attribute, this pseudo class is being selected and this style is being applied. For the input elements especially, we can give visual feedback of their validity of the input. So let's say here our input element is required. Okay, so this input element is required, set to required, and if it is invalid, that means this is a required field. If you did not fill this form is kind of invalid. So if we wanted to give a visual feedback of this field, we can give it like this: input, and the type is equals to text. So here we are relying on the attribute selector because we wanted to select only the inputs that are the type set to text. Now I wanted to extend this selector to select the elements that are marked required and then which are in the invalid state. Now for these elements, I wanted to apply the background color of red. Okay. Now this is marked required. That's what we can see. And it is empty and it is not a valid input, and this style is being picked and applied. Now if I enter some value, now this has become valid because it is required and there is some input in it. So this is now valid, it is not invalid. So now you see this styles not being applied. So you can rely on this pseudo classes to give visual feedback about your inputs. Let us shift our focus towards checkbox or radio button. Radio to understand few more pseudo classes. So here I've taken one radio button and a checkbox, and let me write a selector to these guys. Now I want to write the common styles for radio and checkbox both, so I put a comma and applying the same sets of styles to both the elements. So if a checkbox or a radio button marked as checked, now I wanted to increase the size of that element. Now using CSS we can detect if they are checked or unchecked. So that's what we are doing here. So let me reduce the size of this guy a bit and increase the size of this code so that we could see. Now if I select this, in the selected state or checked state, this style are being applied. Same goes with radio. So this, I made a mistake because I need to change. So this for attribute looks for the specific ID of that particular element and establishes that connection, and this will act as an anchor point or click point to that. So you cannot check radio button unless you have another radio button in the same groups. That's the reason I'm unable to uncheck, but you could see that behavior with the checkbox. In this chapter, let us understand some of the important CSS metrics that are pixel, percentage, VH, view height or view width. Let's start with pixel. So if there is a div, let me add some background and padding so we could see the box in HTML preview. So if you could see, there was no width assigned to this box. So if I assign a width of 500 px, so a pixel is a minute unit of a particular display or a screen. So we are saying no matter what, you should occupy the width of 500 pixels as a constant, and this will not be affected by any of the state that browser is in. So this is a constant that we are assigning it to say, and this is not going to change even if you are reducing beyond 500 or something. There is a scroll actually appearing, so no matter what, it will not shrink or scale. It's a constant that's being assigned. And with percentages, that is not the case. You could say the width to occupy to 50%. So this will be not constant. Instead, it will react to the size, or it will be responsive to the size of that window. It will occupy the width of 50% in the available width for the window, because this is the root element in the body. That is the reason it is occupying 50. So if I have a box inside another box, okay, so what actually happens is, you said 50%, so this is occupying 50% space of the parent. Okay, this box occupied 50% space because the parent is the entire body that has the entire width that is available. So it has taken a 50% of the available width. But whereas the duplicate item that I just created inside the box have actually considered this as a parent, and this has 50% of the width, and a 50% of that 50% is actually 25% is what you're seeing. Percentage inherits the initial base value, the 100%, from the parent. So in the first box case, it was the body, that was the full width of screen, and in the second case, it is the width of the first box. The next two metrics that we need to understand is the viewport width and viewport height. So a viewport width is 1% of the entire available width on the viewport, not on the body. So it does not consider the body or element or its parent or anything, unlike the percentage value. Entire viewport width, 1% of the entire viewport width will become 1 unit of VW, and 1% of the entire viewport height that is available will become 1 VH value. So let me demonstrate that. So here let me take another box, div.box, and I want to assign a class for this because I wanted to reuse this some of the styles that I have here. For VW, this is another class I've taken, so let me copy this, let me write some styles. I'll have a different background color for this, and this for this box I will assign a width of 50 VW, that is viewport width. Text in it, so it is not really visible. Now we could see this box, as you could see, the violet box has slighter more width than the blue box, because VH or VW doesn't consider the padding that is on the body element or root element. This 50% has actually considered this or excluded this padding or margin that is on the body. This 50% has considered the available width in the body, but this box has actually considered the entire width of that particular window. When we say 50W, that has slightly more width than the 50% because it is taking 50% of the entire available width and started placing the element from here to here. And it is the same way, it will consider VH, viewport height. So this is the 50% of the entire available viewport height, and if I start reducing it, it will also reduce. If I start increasing it, it will increase. So that is the unit of VH. And the major difference is, no matter what, like if I have another item, another same box inside the same box, it will not consider the parent's width or anything. It will still be stick to the entire viewport height or viewport width. The next two metrics that we are going to discuss are reactive to the font sizes. So for that, let me create some sample LIs. So here we have 3 LIs, and let me add some styles to them. So now let me assign some font size to this. For this LI, so here with this selector, I'm assigning some font size to this LI, like 2 ems. Now you could see the font size got increased for these list items, and this ems are very reactive to the parent's font size. So if I can reduce this to 10px, now we see that has got reduced significantly. So what are we saying here? If the parent font size is 20px, double it. So that means you multiply it with 2 and assign that value to this font size. So if it is 10px, the size of this font, the LI's font, will be 20px. If it is 20, it will be 40 on this list item. When we use the same M on its margin or padding, so that is a different story, because if we say 1 M, so this M is actually affected by the font size that it is on the elements. Rather, this M, depending on this font size, this will depend on the size of this guy. So if I say 1.5 M, you could see the padding is significantly reduced too. So if we use it on font size, that will be reactive to the parent's font size. If I use it on margin or padding, that will be reactive to this font size. There is another unit, that is rem, that is only reactive to the parent element, either HTML or body's font size, not on the parent element. So let's see that. I have created another class for ULRem and I've assigned, and let me use the same styles that I used here and change my color to if I arrange the font, if I assign the font size of 1.5 rems, and even if I reduce or increase the font size on my parent element or this a parent element, this has no effect or whatsoever on this particular child items. So you could see whatever the font size I changes, that has no effect on this LI items, and this is dependent on the HTML root element font size. So if I try to increase the HTML's base size 30px, now this elements that have assigned the rem value 1.5, now this is now 30 into 1.5 is the value that is being assigned to this. If I change it to 10, and that got reduced. Using ems and rems for the font size is really beneficial in most of the cases, because each device or each user or each browser will have its own settings. Maybe user wants to see the font bigger, so he might set the base fonts in his browser preferences more, and rems could really look into that, and it will start multiplying from that base font. Like if user has set to 30 pixels, this will become 30 into 1.5, so that will follow the user preferences in the settings. So that is the reason it is preferred to use ems and rems for the font sizes. Using ems and rems for the font size is really beneficial in most of the cases, because each device or each user or each browser will have its own settings. Maybe user wants to see the font bigger, so he might set the base fonts in his browser preferences more, and rems could really look into that, and it will start multiplying from that base font. Like if user has set to 30 pixels, this will become 30 into 1.5, so that will follow the user preferences in the settings. So that is the reason it is preferred to use ems and rems for the font sizes. CSS Position property defines the position of an HTML element in relation to its parent or the viewport. The position property can have the following values: static, relative, absolute, and fixed. Static is the normal default value. So this value will actually set the normal flow to the element in relation to its document flow. Relative property adds a different offset for its original position, like top, bottom, left, right, respectively. Absolute property looks for a nearest ancestor which is having a position property set to relative, and it follows. If no position ancestor, it uses the document body and moves along with the page scrolling. Fixed position, on the other hand, position relative to the viewport, which means it will not move even if the page is scrolled. So using this property, we can also affect the behavior of top, left, bottom, right properties, which is determine the location of the element on the screen. Let us see some use cases where we need to change this type of properties from static to some other properties. So here is an example that we come across every now and then in the website. So this is kind of a component which is blocking me to read through this content and asking me to kind of for the newsletter. So we can develop this kind of component, and we will depend on this position property very much to create this kind of component. So let me come back and see. Here I have some button. We will make this div to spread across the page and block the clicks on this button. So for that, I'll copy the class and I will change the position property to absolute. Okay, as soon as I put position property to absolute and set z index to 100, okay, and if you apply some background color RGBA 0, 0, 0, 0, which is 0.8. so what I'm doing is red, green, blue to all zeros, that means black color, and I want 80% of transparency applied. So you could see these styles have been applied, but the height and width is not defined. Like, where do you want me to start and where do you want me to end? As we discussed in the introduction, position absolute property needs top, left, bottom points to kind of start and end. Let's define that. I want you to start at top 0, left 0. So now we got top 0 and left 0. We also need bottom 2 be set to 0, right also set to 0. So now I'm asking you need to spread to all these points on the page. Top 0, left 0, bottom 0 and right 0. Now you got that overlay style, and which is already blocking the clicks on the backend. If you want some content, something like this, let me add some styles to this dialog content section. So here I got added some styles like some height and width to it and background color, and the position for this particular element starting from 0, 0, by default HTML suggests the stack of elements to start from 0, 0, but you can adjust that positioning with some margin and other things like this. Or if you wanted to move slightly bit to left, okay, you can say position relative and left to 30 pixels, okay, or 40 pixels. So this is not the exact way that we should be doing, but I'm just illustrating how can we depend on these properties and create the components that we want in HTML. We obviously need not to specifically talk about the static property because it's the default value set to all the HTML elements, and it will promote the static flow of elements in a stack order. And these are all the properties like absolute, relative and fixed are the ones changing that traditional flow to a different flow so that we can achieve our desired output. Syntactically awesome style sheets. SASS. SASS is a language that gives you superpowers to write CSS. So in other words, if you set out to create a modern UI with CSS, you will repeat a lot of code in your CSS. SASS comes to the rescue to solve this problem. SASS provides a compiler to compile a completely different language into CSS. You could write SASS in two different file formats, SASS and SCSS. SASS kind of old format where we avoid braces and semicolons to write CSS, but mostly the famous file format is SCSS. So through this tutorial we're going to use SCSS. There are different ways to set up the SASS compiler in your local. One is setting up through Node and the other one is setting up through a plugin of VS Code. So for this tutorial we're going to see the plugin setup. So here is my VS Code and you need to set up two plugins. One is Live Server. You need to install this plugin and also the Live SASS compiler. Once you are installed and ready, you can go to a file section and create a folder and create a SASS file like this. I just tidy up my desktop. So here is an empty file. So let me write some CSS in it. Normal CSS. I'm not doing anything fancy. I'm just creating a class. So as I said earlier, any valid CSS is also a valid SCSS. So I'm writing a valid CSS now. So as soon as I saved this, the CSS compiler is watching the files. So if it is not watching, you would see a button like this and you need to click that. So as soon as you click that, it keeps watching the changes for these SCSS files in the folder and keeps compiling them into CSS. So the compiler takes care of the job to convert your SCSS into CSS. So basically the killer feature of SCSS is the variables. So what is variable? Variable is something that you create a placeholder, you create a container for your value, like something like this, background, and you will set a value to it like blue, and you actually use that variable, and if I am using it 10 times, so basically what is happening, the value is actually kind of contained in this namespace, and I use this name wherever I want the blue color to appear, and as soon as I save this, the compiler actually compiled the SCSS into SCSS, and if you look at the CSS, you will see the blue everywhere. So in future, if you didn't like blue, or your client asked you to change it to orange, you could literally change like this in one place, and all the number of instances that you used, wherever you used, if I save this SASS, you will see that color created, updated. The next question we want to answer is, how do I use this CSS file? So simply I can create an index file here like this. I can refer the CSS here in my HTML document, and I'll have this file once it is compiled. So yeah, now we have the setup. Let us also open this index file on the left hand side with the help of live server. I don't have to open the CSS to write CSS. I can directly write it in SCSS file, and that get compiled into main.css, and I've already linked that main.css in HTML. So whatever I write in SCSS, that's gonna reflect in the index. So I created this paragraph and class, my class. Now I've written some. So I go to SCSS file and I change the color. The CSS compiled with the help of CSS compiler, and the CSS updated, and the index file got updated CSS, and I've got the updated style in the HTML. So that's how the whole cycle is gonna be. Let me create some structure to demonstrate further features of SCSS. So let me take a container. So if I save it, I'm gonna see a structure like this. I just want the hi Ganesh here to be occupy half of the space, and hello world should be occupy half of the space. So how can I do that? So yes, you could use display flex and make them flex items to align here, and then you center align this guy and you center align this guy. So yeah, strategy is good. Let's get done with SCSS. So SCSS next killer feature is nesting, the nested mode. So you can first create a class for container and create another class inside the container. So if I say display flex refresh, these two guys are now side by side, and I'll say left panel flex 1 and right panel flex 1. Now these guys took half and half space, but I want this guy to center, so I could say display flex justify content center, and the same to this. I need to say display flex. Now this guy, let me add some background color to this guy. The warning, the error, that where did I mess up, and so it's nice to have a compiler like this to avoid mistakes. So yeah, I have the red color for my container, and I just define. Now if you see, the styles have applied. This is how the CSS got compiled. In case if you are wondering that these are something that you haven't written and still populated, so SCSS takes care of browser compatibility as well. So these are all the properties that are compatible with specific browser, so the property that you have written, and SCSS takes care about adding few more properties that are compatible with different browser versions. So if you could see here, these three lines are mostly similar. So can you move it to a different location, a common location, and reuse? Yes, you can do that in mixins. So let me move this three lines into a single mixin. So this is a syntax of a mixin. You should @mixin, and you should name the mixin. So the mixin name is flex and center, because these three lines are meant to like flex and center and apply some background color, so it's okay. Let me move these three lines and remove these three lines here, and I can say include @include flex and center, and also here. So as soon as I save these things, now with these three lines now shared, so if I can go to CSS, I can see the lines have been copied into both the CSS, but the only problem is here that both of the flex items have actually same color. So I can actually modify that. I can send in a property like this, bg color, and I can send it from here. So instead of using primary, I can use this variable here. For this variable, to replace this variable, I can send the primary and secondary color from here. So let me do that. Basically what is happening here is I'm sending in the primary color and secondary color to replace the bg color, and based upon which parameter I send to this mixin, that color will be rendering in the respective location. So if I save this, as you can see, primary and secondary color, I use those three lines with this parameter in place. With the help of this parameter, I just customize the color to change. For this instance, I used primary, and for this instance, I use secondary. There are certain flow controls in mixin also. So you could, for suppose, if you wanted to create a box, whether to have a bug, a rounded corner or not to have rounded corner, you can create such kind of, you can actually set up those kind of conditions. Let me write a mixin for that. Mixin avatar. So I'm trying to add an avatar class. So here I'm actually saying size, width, size, and height is also should be the size. So if I pass in 100 pixels to it, it will create a 100 by 100 width. So if if the expression, so if rounded is set to true, then it will apply the inner one. So if say border, radius, size by 2. So if you need a rounded corner one, so if you send this rounded to true, it will actually, this condition will become true, and this property will be added to the class. If not, by default it will be false. So this is what I'm saying. So let me add some classes. So out here in the container, I would say box avatar, and I will say @include avatar mixture, and the size is 100 pixels and false, rounded to false, rounded to. And if I want a circular one, if I want a circular one, then I can set this property to true, and I will get those classes. So if I go back to CSS, if I wanted to find these out, I will have, so I have an issue there. Okay, so no mixin. So this is kind of should be before this code block. So it was saying the no mixin available after that. So now I have generated, and you could see box avatar 100 pixels 100 pixels, and if condition is satisfied for circle avatar, and it's added border 50 pixels. So at each is something it iterates on certain values. Like if I have a set like this, like paddings, and say I have 5, 10, 20, 30. This is my number set. Now if I iterate on this set, at each padding, $padding, I'm actually creating a new padding. So each $padding in paddings. So each time it picks up one element and executes for the rest of the elements. So at this point of time I can generate as many classes as I want with these paddings. So I can say p hyphen. So this is an interpolation in SCSS. So I can actually print this value here within this braces, dollar and braces, sorry, pound and braces, and I can, and for the first time if it is going through 5, so this will become p hyphen 5. Second time, second iteration, it will become p hyphen 10, 20 and 30 same way. So I can say padding dollar padding, not paddings, padding, that means this item. So if I save this, so I will see number of classes generated, like p5, padding 5, padding 10, padding 20, padding 30. But this unit is not actually a valid unit because it should be in pixels or rems or whatever it is. So I can simply put a plus and px, and that will actually render 5 pixels, 10 pixels, 20 pixels and 30 pixels. So this is another flow control. So the next flow control is for $i from 1 through 3. So that means it will run for 3 times, 1, 2, 3, from 1 to 3. Each time it runs, the I value will become the iteration value. So I will be the number of that particular iteration. So if I wanted to, if this is running for three times, I can generate 3 different classes. So I can say li of nth child. So nth child is a pseudo class. The pseudo class selects one particular element of that particular number. So I can say pound, and I can say put $i. That means first iteration it will be 1, second iteration it will be 2, and third iteration it will be 3. So I'm actually writing a background color. So I can write a background color, like let's say I have taken a green color. So now I can use another function called lighten, a method called lighten. So what happens is that this lighten method will lighten the color that I have given here, this variable. This will lighten a color to a certain %. So here I said lighten the green to a certain %. So if it is for the first time, the I is 1, right? So 1 into 5 is 5. So for the first item, green color will lighten 5%. Second iteration, this will become 2, and it will be 2 into 5, 10% lighten, and third iteration it is 3 into 5, 15%. So if I save this, I can see 3 different classes. Nth child of 1 is this color, 2 little lighten, 3 little lighten. If I have a better darker color, you will see the difference here itself. So let me pick a better darker version of the green and save it, and now I can see, now you can spot the difference here. So it's actually kind of lightened. So we can see the demo also. So here you will li, if I save it, you could see the lighten happening. So D green, a little bit lighter green, little bit lighter green. In the nested elements, there is one another subject that I should mention, is that descendant or pseudo selector additions in the nested element. So I can add ampersand and put a pseudo class there and directly add, and I can put some styles that needs to be rendered there. So background color, and I can say secondary, and if I save it, sorry, this is primary. If I put it primary, so if I hover this, the style is changing. That means for the same right panel, for the hover pseudo selector, I'm changing the color, opposite color. I use the primary color, secondary color for the background, and I'm changing the primary color for on hover. If you wanted to see the style that is generated for hover, I think if you put a ampersand and put the pseudo selector, that is going to generate a style like this. Okay, for the right panel, the background color is this, and the hover, the background color is to change it to this. FlexBox model is CSS layout module. So let's see it in action. So let me create a container and let me create some style for it. I want just to add a border. So there's a border to it. Let me add some items in it. Now I have some items here. So let me add some style to the items as well, so that they can easily be identifiable. So there's a container with border. These are the items in it, and they are block elements, as you can see. So how do I start creating a flex layout? You can start creating the flex layout by changing the container property to display flex. As soon as you set the container property to flex, the items inside the container become flex items, and they have occupied some space, and you can change these items flow. So you can set the flex direction to column. Now you can see your previous layout was this only, and also you can set them to form a reverse order. So it's the same column layout only, but it's bottom up. They started at the bottom, the column started at the bottom and went to the top. So same way you can do it with row 2. You can say row reverse, and all the items starts from right in the same order, item 1 2 3. Let me put back to row. Now if I have these elements that were bigger and more, they are occupying the space in the same line, like there's a scroll coming, they are not actually, they're overflown their containers. How can I fix it? So you can fix it with one more property called flex wrap. You can set it to wrap. Now your elements that are overflown the container will be wrapped to the next row, and you can set it to wrap reverse. What happens, instead of taking in the next line, it actually pushes the rest of the elements to the next line, and the last item will go to the top. I should have numbered these items better so that you could see that difference. Now you could figure out 1 2 3 4 5, and the sixth, when there is a sixth element and there is no enough space, it has pushed all the elements to the bottom, and sixth item sits on the top. The flex flow is kind of shorthand for these two properties, so you can set it flex flow row and wrap. And this is a shorthand for both of the properties like flex direction and flex wrap. What if I want my items to start from right? One more question, how can I distribute the space between them, the leftover space? Like they should be, one should be here, one should be here, one should be here, with equally distributed. We can do all these things with one more property called justify content. Justify content is another property that will help to distribute these elements across the main axis in the container. So you can set it to flex end. So these items will be moved to end on the main axis, or start or center. You can set it to start. That means flex start, start or flex start, you can call it both. So they come to the start, or you can move them to center. So they'll be on the main axis, the alignment starts from center and distributed. These items will be distributed on both the sides. And also you can distribute the space between the leftover space. The same property will be used to distribute the leftover space between around these items. So let me demo that. Space around. This property actually distributes the leftover space around each element, or you can set it to between. Now the space between distributes the space, extra space or leftover space between the flex items that are here. To demonstrate the align items property, I probably need to increase the container height. Let me set some height to the container. Now if you could see, whenever I increased my container, these items have actually stretched out to fill the container height. So you could control that. So you could say align items and say flex start. So they starts from the top, and you can actually move it to the bottom. You can say flex end, or you can set it to stretch. So this was the earlier default result what we were seeing. You can also put it to center. Now these alignments happening on the cross axis. Next flex property that we should look at is align content. So to demonstrate align content, I probably need to add few more items here, 3. So let me add now I have 10 items in my container. The entire content is kind of added and distributed, and it's wrapped. It is now having 2 rows. So if I wanted to push the entire content to bottom or top or to the center, not just one row, entire content, the whole content of it, to push it, you can control it with align content property. You can put it to end. All the content will be pushed to the bottom and grows to the top, and also the same with start. Everything starts from the top and everything is grown towards bottom, and you can put it to center too. So everything actually kind of spans from center and grow to the bottom and top. Next up is gap, like how much gap we need between these items, how much space we need to keep. So that kind of property that we're going to look at. So let me remove the margin here, not to have some margin, space around, space between, and see them plain. Like now there's extra letter in the 10, this is causing the extra space here. So let me put it 9 or 0. Now it is in the same lines of the other elements. So just for demonstration purposes, I'm keeping everything on the same width. So now that there's no gap between them and everything is kind of stick together, you can set the gap. So instead of having it in center, let me move it to the flex start. So I want all the content to start from top. So now I can set the gap property to 10 pixels. You could see what happens. Every element has some space between them, that is set to 10 pixels. So this is more consistent. This makes the space kind of distributed. You can actually set it to row gap 10px. It will only puts the gap between rows, and you can also set the column gap. Column gap to 20px. See, the gap is not much, having not much different. So now we could see the gap of the row is 10 pixels. The gap between the columns is kind of, let me remove all the items and put back the 3 original items. Next item is FlexGrow. FlexGrow property kind of defines how your child element should grow, how they should occupy the space by stretching themselves. So the grow actually kind of goes on to the child element. So let me add some child classes like item 1. So now I have classes, different classes for all these child items. So now if I set everything to flex 1, now each item has grown because I set to flex property to 1. That means I'm actually directing the items to stretch a bit to occupy some space that is in the same row. So let me remove the gaps. Just say gap 2 pixels. The flex property kind of allow the item to grow to occupy its own share space. So if there are 3 items, these 3 items have allowed to occupy their share. So if it is divided into 3 parts, each other item occupied their share. So let's say if I wanted to assign extra space to this item, so I can go here, I can put it to 2. Now what happens if this property actually occupy x space, whenever I set it to 2, so it actually multiplies this share and occupy that much space. So if this is flex 1, if this is flex 2, twice of these items, and that will be added to item 2. So yeah, not typically that. So it will split into 4 different columns, and 2 columns will be item 2 and 1 column will be item 1 and 1 column will be item 3. So it works that way. Now the order is set in the childs. If you wanted to change this order kind of like this, sorry, the order starts from, so if I wanted to swap some spaces, some of the items, I can set it like this too. So my second item has come to first position and my first item has come to second position. Or if you want the last item to come first, you can set it order to 0, 1 and 2. Now we have the reverse order 3, 2, 1. This is how order works. Next item to understand is flex shrink. So if I set one item to flex 1, and if I wanted the rest of the items to shrink and kind of give more space to item 1, so I can say flex shrink 1. So kind of saying that not to take up any space. So these items stayed the same and kind of given the large space to the flex item 1. For ES, we used methods like tables, floats, positioning, inline block to create user interfaces. But all of these methods were like essential hacks. The CSS grid layout completely changes the way we design user interfaces. This two-dimensional grid-based layout does not only do the job very well, but also with ease. Before we begin, it is important to understand the terminology of CSS grid layout. Assume this is a web page. This is a typical grid layout looks like. This is called a grid container, and this is called a grid item, and this is called a grid cell, and this is the grid track. Let's go ahead and create some structure in HTML. Div container, div grid item. I might need it. Let's save it and see. Actually, we haven't added any content in them. So let me add some content. Yeah, now I have some content. So let me add some styles to these items so they are visually identifiable. So container width, let's add some background color first. Yeah, I have some background color for the container, and let me add the color for the items as well. Make the font color to white. Yeah, here is my container. I've added this width and height so that we can look at how grid is aligning the items in columns and rows. So let me add some padding to these guys too. Yeah, now these items have some padding, but we cannot really see where the one item ended and the other item is starting. So let's add some margin. That's it. We could see the container, the items one below the other. So let's go ahead and add, make this container as grid container. So to do that, we need to add display property to grid. So as soon as I set it to this, the items have become grid items. Now the container is grid container and the items in it are grid items. So grid items, they tend to stretch into rows and columns. So here you can see they have stretched into a single row, I guess so. So let's try to convert into a grid structure. Let's make it look like a grid structure. So to do that, we need first columns. So let me add some columns. Grid template columns. This is a CSS property that will help us to create columns. So you can actually define fixed width for your columns. You can say like this: 200 pixels, 200 pixels, and 300 pixels. So what we are doing, we are actually splitting the 700 pixels width into 3 different columns. So as soon as I save this, you would see the 3 columns have been created and the width has applied respectively. So 200 for the first, 200 for the second, 300 for the last. That's about adding fixed width to your columns. You can also add flexible width like 20%, 30%, and what have we left? Out of 100, 50 was gone, and 50%. You can say the last column to take 50%. If you could see, these two columns combinedly take 50%, and this one item itself took 50%. The same with the second row, same with the third row. In the third row, we don't have the third item. Okay, so I only defined the row columns, not the rows. But grids, this is kind of implicit mechanism of grid layout. So when you say columns, if it is overflown, the next element will actually flow to the next row. So the rows will be implicit, you don't have to define, so it will be automatically be distributed. So you can explicitly define how much space you want for your row. We will look into it. So, and there is one more metric that you need to aware of here. That is a flexible metric. We can measure it in fractions. So you can say 1 FR, 1 FR, and 1 FR. So once you said one fraction, one fraction, one fraction, so yeah, you are splitting your the available width into 3 fractions, and each fraction will have a certain width. Okay, 3 divisions. So if I want to have something to take up more space than the other, we can say 2 FR. So basically what happens, it splits into 4, and 2 portions will be consumed by the third column, and 1 for the first, 1 for the second. So this is another flexible metric for adding flexible sizes to your column. So for now, this is fixed, the whole width is fixed. You can actually remove this width and see it in action, like see 3 columns. You should understand visually, right? That's the reason I have added the height and width. It's okay if you don't have to height also, that is fine, because if you added some height, so it'll actually try to fit in the elements in the height that you have given. Like if I say 700 pixels, the items are going to be fit in 3 different rows. As I mentioned earlier, the rows are implicit, they are automatically created, but you can also control the rows. So the property to control the rows is grid template rows. So you can like columns, how you did with the columns, you can also do the same with rows too. You can give some units, some measurements like this, and your rows are created 200, 200 and 200. Now there isn't leftover space because you only use 600, and the rest is kind of leftover. If you make it the last item to have 300 pixels, now it's kind of full. Before we move on to next topic, so there's one another CSS function that you need to know, that is min-max function. So with min-max function, you can actually pass in the minimum width that that particular column can have, and the maximum width that it can take. So basically you can set it to auto, because the second item, this is the minimum width that I want to occupy, and there is the minimum width I want to occupy, and there is maximum limit is auto. So if there is no content in it generally, so it will not stretch. If I add some content in it, it will stretch to a maximum limit of that. So if there is no content, it will be it will stay the same, like it will not explode. But use min-max with caution. Next, you need to know how should we assign gutters for the rows and columns. So you can assign like this, column gap, and you can put it to 10px. you could see the gap is increased here, and also you can do with the rows too. Rows gap, row gap. So as you can see, the gap between the rows and gap between the columns have added to. Before we move on to the next topic, we need to understand this picture. In this picture, you see the lines numbered on the column, like you would see 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 lines. For the rows, it is only 1, 2, 3. So the grid lines are numbered in such a way that you can figure out what I am talking about. So if you want to extend the grid item, one grid item, to different columns, multiple columns, you can actually extend it using the number reference on the lines. So if suppose if you want to extend one grid item to 2 columns, so you can you can say start it at 1 and end it at 3, so that the one grid item will be spanned to 2 different grid cells. Let us see what I meant. So let me first remove these columns, gaps. So if I want my grid item 1, this grid item, to extend to 2 different columns, so I can do that too. So what I can simply do, I've already added this grid item class here. So I can grid column. I can say grid column 1 by 4. So it actually extended to end. I just want, so it should start at 1 line, 2 line and 3 line. I think here should be enough. See, the first item has extended to 2 grid cells. So it started at line number 1, line number 2 and ended at line number 3. So that's how you can extend, and you can do the same with row 2. Let me just add the style grid row 1 by 3. So what I'm doing here, I'm saying started 1, 2 and ended 3, and here you say. So as soon as I saved this, so it is extended from line 1, 2 and 3. So it is occupying some of the grid cells. Because of that reason, some of the grid cells have been pushed down. You need to remember what you are doing. You need to look out for the changes that you are doing when you are extending. Let's just try to create a layout with whatever we learned this far, so that we can understand the real-time application of each of the feature we learned this far. So let me go ahead and create some elements so that I can build something like a UI or website, something like that. So I have my container here. Let me add some of the divs, like header and header like this, header, so I need to add some styles. So this time I'm not gonna add any fancy styles, height or width or anything. I'm just gonna say display grid. So the container now is grid container. So now you could see everything has become grid items. Now let us build this UI with a good concept called grid areas. What is grid area? You can actually name one element, grid item, to have a name, and we can span that name to different grid cells. Let's go ahead and create these, add some styles to these guys. Header, now that we have the elements, let's go ahead and create some of the columns. I want to repeat here, repeat for 4 times with 25% of width. So as soon as I given this, now the grid container has 4 columns, each of the column having 25% of the width. And now let's name our header to have a name called header. So let's give a grid area name, grid area header. So I want my grid area to occupy the entire row, so I can do like this: areas, a string, header, header, and header for all the 4 columns. So it's I guess each iteration refers to a grid cell. So I've just have had it 4 times, and my header actually spanned to 4 columns. I can do the same with the nav too. I just want the navigation to kind of completely occupy the space. And copy this name, come here, nav, nav, and nav, nav. Now for the columns occupied by nav. Features, the same feature will also occupy 4 other columns, but I can have this feature. Let's add the feature beside the nav as a 1 column like this. Navigation is here, feature is there, and my footer is like this. Footer usually goes alone, so it is not accompanied by any element. Height 100 px. Here you go. So go in here and add an image. Okay, source src. I have some image here. Let me add that. A logo is attached. So there is another video to how to create a toolbar that is given in the description. You can actually use that style and create a toolbar in here, and you can have some HTML here and create a navigation and place some feature content here. So like that, you can on and on go and design that layout. So let me at least make some sense out of this design. So navigation height not more than 40 pixels. Okay, and now the feature is kind of increasing along with the navigation, and I don't want that, so I can do this. I can allow the navigation to extend and have the features as its own row. Yeah, now features is also having. What if, can we create a grid inside a grid? Yes, we can create inside feature. Let's try to create some of the feature columns. So div grid. Now we have 4 features inside the features. So I can convert these features again to display grid. This has become grid container now, and now I can have this feature item class here and say padding 40 px. Here we go, grid template, columns, 2 columns, 2 different rows. I can say 50%, 50%, 2 columns. I want the gutter, some gutter. I can put. So basically, what you're not seeing the space here is the features doesn't have a background color, otherwise you would have seen it. So let me add some background color here. Background color, let me put it green. So now you could see the gap between these guys. So it's kind of heavy. So I can put some feature content here, like an image or something like this. Something like this, and you can go on and add on some HTML here. It keeps scale. So basically what is happening, you are creating an HTML layout out of the grid system. Okay, footer is now kind of like this. You can increase the footer size. I think you can place some content in this footer. So maybe like this, and it keeps extending. So I can say I'm just filling the space. I'm not making any sense with the content. I'm just filling the space. Now if you could see, I kind of getting somewhere. So I can have the nav items here like this. I'm running out of ideas, so I'm not worried. So let me add some styles to the nav. Padding 20px, save it, line height 20px. So basically what's happening is my items are aligning into the top. I can say I can ask the alignment to be center, like align items center or something. So I can go on and make it more beautiful, but I guess goal is achieved. Like how can we use the grid system to create layouts? This is one sample demo.